I walked into the kitchen and found my fiancée on the counter with a man between her knees. She looked over his shoulder and said my name like a question. I didn't answer. I came home earlier than planned because the job wrapped up fast, and the site supervisor decided not to stretch the shift just to look busy. It was one of those rare evenings when the day unexpectedly gives you time back, and I remember thinking I might surprise Priya with dinner, or at least sit down together without one of us checking the clock. I parked 2 blocks away because someone had taken my usual spot, walked the rest of the way, and noticed the apartment lights were on even though she had told me she was exhausted and heading to bed early. The building hallway was quiet. No music, no laughter leaking under doors, nothing unusual. I unlocked the apartment and stepped inside without making noise, not because I was sneaking, but because I was tired and operating on autopilot. My jacket was still on when I crossed the living room. My keys were still in my hand. I remember the smell first, something warm and unfamiliar, like food that had been cooked for more than one person. That detail stuck with me because Priya rarely cooked on weekdays. The kitchen light was on. I turned the corner without slowing down. She was sitting on the counter. Her back was against the cabinets, her legs open, and a man I had never seen before was standing between her knees. His hands were on her thighs, his body angled toward her like he belonged there. It was not a moment caught in motion or something ambiguous that required interpretation. It was stable, settled, and confident, as if they had been there for a while and had no reason to expect interruption. Priya looked over his shoulder. She said my name, but it came out wrong, like a question she had not prepared to ask. There was no panic yet, just confusion, as if her mind was still catching up to what her eyes were seeing. I noticed that because it told me something important. This was not a mistake made in a rush. This was routine interrupted. I did not answer. I did not raise my voice or step forward. I did not ask who he was or what was going on. My body refused to participate in the scene the way movies teach people to react. Everything slowed down instead. I noticed the small things with strange clarity. The way the counter edge pressed into her thigh. The way the man's shoulders tensed only after he realized I was not leaving. The way my own reflection looked in the microwave door, still wearing a work jacket, still holding keys. I turned around and walked out. I closed the door behind me without slamming it. My hands were steady enough to lock it. That detail matters because it was the first sign that something in me had gone quiet instead of exploding. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening for footsteps or voices behind the door, but there were none. Whatever they were doing inside, it did not include chasing after me. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, not because I needed exercise, but because I did not want to stand still in a small space with mirrors. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I walked without direction for several blocks, past places I recognized, and then places I did not. My phone buzzed in my pocket more than once, but I did not check it. My mind kept trying to reframe what I had seen into something smaller or more manageable, but it failed every time. There was no version of that image that could be misunderstood. There was no missing context that would make it acceptable. The only thing left to question was how long it had been happening and how much of my recent life had been staged around it. I ended up sitting in my car without remembering how I got there. The engine was off. The streetlight flickered above the windshield. I finally checked my phone. There were missed calls from Priya and several messages stacked on top of each other. I did not open them. I scrolled past and called Oscar instead. Oscar answered on the second ring. He asked if everything was okay, and I told him I had just walked into something I could not explain. I did not describe it in detail. I did not need to. He went quiet for a moment, and that pause told me more than his words did. He admitted that he had seen Priya at a bar near his office a couple of weeks earlier. She had not been alone. She had been close with the same man, close enough that it did not look casual. Oscar said he had almost texted me that night, but Priya had mentioned me in passing, like a prop, and he convinced himself it was none of his business. He apologized without making excuses, which I respected more than justification. That call reframed everything. The late nights she blamed on stress. The sudden insistence on separate schedules. The way she had started locking her phone and angling the screen away when she texted. I had noticed all of it and chosen to trust instead of interrogate. That trust now felt less like virtue and more like negligence. I drove to a 24-hour diner and sat in a booth without ordering anything for a long time. I needed neutral ground. Somewhere that was not the apartment and not the car. When the waitress finally came by, I ordered coffee I did not finish. My hands had started to shake, not from anger, but from delayed adrenaline. Sometime after midnight, I went back. The apartment was dark when I unlocked the door. The kitchen was clean, too clean, like someone had erased evidence instead of tidying up. Priya was asleep in the bedroom, facing the wall. I stood in the doorway long enough to confirm that I felt nothing recognizable. No urge to wake her. No urge to touch her. Just distance. I walked back into the kitchen. I opened drawers I had no reason to open before, cabinets I rarely used. I was not looking for proof so much as confirmation that my intuition had not suddenly become unreliable. In the back of a drawer beneath old manuals and batteries, I found a phone I did not recognize. It was powered off. No case. No scratches. Clean in a way that suggested it was handled carefully. I did not turn it on. I placed it back where I found it, exactly as it was, and closed the drawer. That choice mattered more than anything else I did that night. Turning it on would have given me answers too quickly, and I needed to understand the structure of the lie before I collapsed it. I needed to know who else was standing on it, and who would fall when it gave way. I slept on the couch without setting an alarm. In the morning, Priya acted like someone who believed damage could still be managed. She spoke carefully. She avoided specifics. She framed the previous night as something complicated that deserved conversation later. I listened without interrupting and nodded where nodding was expected. I told her I needed time to think and that we would talk after work. She accepted that too easily. That was when I knew this was not her first crisis rehearsal. By the time I left the apartment, I was no longer reacting. I was observing. The image of her on the counter no longer shocked me. It anchored me instead. It was the reference point everything else would be measured against. The strange thing about deciding not to confront someone is how quickly they relax once they believe the danger has passed. Priya adjusted faster than I expected. Within a day, she moved like someone who had survived a close call and convinced herself the threat was gone. Her voice softened. Her schedule became organized again. She started talking about the wedding as if continuity itself could erase what had already happened. I played my role carefully. I did not withdraw completely, because distance raises questions. I stayed present enough to appear undecided rather than suspicious. I went to work, answered messages, and maintained routines. The only thing I stopped doing was trusting anything at face value. The phone in the drawer became my anchor point. I did not touch it for 2 days. I wanted to see whether it would be missed. It was not. Priya never searched the kitchen in a way that suggested panic or urgency. That told me it was not her primary device. It was a tool used only when necessary, which meant it existed to hide something specific. On the third night, after she fell asleep, I turned it on. There was no lock screen, no fingerprint, no passcode. That detail alone spoke volumes. People protect what they use daily. This phone was not meant for browsing or idle communication. It was meant to disappear when needed. The messages were sparse and practical. No romance. No explicit language. Just logistics, confirmations, and brief acknowledgments that assumed familiarity. The contact name was a single letter. That letter matched the first name Oscar had mentioned without realizing it mattered. Ben. The timestamps aligned with Priya's late evenings and sudden errands. The locations matched places she had no reason to be near. One address appeared repeatedly, always during hours she claimed to be with coworkers or friends. I copied nothing and forwarded nothing. I memorized instead. Evidence has weight, but memory has flexibility, and I needed room to maneuver. The next step was understanding who Ben was beyond the role he played in her betrayal. I took a half-day off work and drove to the address I had seen most often. It was a mid-range apartment complex, clean but impersonal, the kind of place people rent when they plan to leave eventually. I did not approach the unit. I sat in the parking lot and watched movement patterns. By early evening, I saw him leave. Ben was older than me by maybe 10 years. Confident posture. Clean clothes that suggested routine rather than effort. He did not look like someone chasing chaos. He looked like someone who believed he had compartmentalized it. I followed at a distance. He drove to a hardware supplier and loaded materials into his truck. That gave me the next thread. Contractors leave trails. Licenses, permits, vendor accounts. I waited 2 days before pulling that information because impatience makes mistakes louder. Public records filled in gaps quickly. Ben Kovic. Licensed contractor. Married. 1 child. Residential address listed in another part of the city. The apartment was not his home. It was his escape hatch. That mattered more than his infidelity. Affairs built on escape collapse violently once the door back to reality closes. I did not contact his wife immediately. I needed to know how deeply Priya was involved and whether she understood the shape of what she was participating in. People tell themselves different stories depending on what version of reality they are trying to survive. At home, Priya increased her investment in appearances. She sent me venue ideas and caterer options. She talked about guest seating and dress alterations. She spoke with optimism that felt rehearsed rather than organic. I noticed she avoided mentioning future dates with flexibility built in, as if she did not trust the calendar yet. One evening, she suggested dinner at home, cooked by her, framed as a gesture. I agreed. During the meal, she spoke about stress, expectations, and wanting to reset. I listened without correcting her narrative. When she asked whether I was still upset about what I had walked into, I said I was still processing. That answer was true enough to avoid suspicion. What she did not know was that processing had already shifted into planning. Through work, I had access to property management contacts. Quiet inquiries confirmed that the apartment Ben used was leased under his company name, not personal. That meant shared liability and violations if misuse could be demonstrated. I stored that information and moved on. The next connection came from a place I did not expect. At a coffee shop near my office, I ran into Irene Feld, someone I had met once at a company mixer months earlier. We exchanged polite conversation that drifted naturally toward work. She mentioned dealing with a difficult situation involving a contractor who had been distracted lately and missing deadlines. She did not name him at first. When she did, it was Ben. I asked neutral questions. She filled in details without realizing their relevance. Complaints from clients. Erratic availability. A sense that something personal was interfering with professional obligations. Nothing illegal, but enough to build a pattern of consequences if examined closely. That confirmed something important. This situation was already leaking beyond the private sphere. I was not introducing chaos. I was stepping into an existing fracture. The final piece of part 2 came together faster than expected. Priya told me she needed to attend a late meeting on Friday. The time and phrasing matched previous patterns. I told her I had plans with Oscar and wished her luck. She left dressed carefully, not overly polished, but intentional. Instead of meeting Oscar, I parked near Ben's apartment again. This time, I did not just watch. I documented arrivals and departures mentally. Priya arrived. She stayed. No attempt at discretion. No sense of urgency. This was not desperation. This was confidence built on the belief that the risk window had closed. While she was there, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the property management office responsible for Ben's apartment. I framed the call as an inquiry about leasing terms for mixed-use properties. I confirmed exactly which clauses prohibited residential misuse and unauthorized occupants. The second call was harder. I contacted Ben's wife. I did not accuse. I did not reveal everything. I told her I had information she deserved to verify independently. I told her where Ben had been spending his time and under what circumstances. I gave her enough to investigate without feeding her conclusions. She did not cry. She did not yell. She asked precise questions and thanked me for the clarity. That reaction told me she already suspected more than she had admitted to herself. By the time Priya returned home that night, something had shifted in the larger system she believed she was manipulating. She did not know it yet, but the walls had started moving inward. By the time Friday arrived, I was no longer improvising. Everything that could be verified had been verified. Everything that could be positioned had been positioned. The only variable left was human behavior, and that was always the most volatile part. I told Priya earlier in the week that I wanted to have a proper dinner at the apartment. Not a reconciliation dinner, not a confrontation, just something calm before we finalized wedding decisions. I framed it as closure in one direction or another. She agreed too quickly, which told me she believed control had returned to her side of the table. I asked her to invite Ben. I did not justify the request. I said I wanted to meet the man I had walked in on. I said that if we were going to move forward or separate cleanly, I needed to see him as a real person rather than a shadow. Priya hesitated for less than a second before agreeing. That hesitation mattered. It meant she believed she could manage him better than she could manage me. I handled the rest of the invitations myself. Ben's wife arrived first. She thought she was meeting a property manager who had information related to one of Ben's work leases. That framing was deliberate. She walked in composed, alert, and observant. I noticed immediately that she looked like someone who had already run every possible scenario in her head and was prepared for confirmation rather than surprise. Ben arrived 10 minutes later. He greeted me with the false confidence of someone who expected hostility but had prepared charm instead. He did not recognize Ben's wife at first because he was not looking for her. That detail alone explained how long he had been lying to himself. When he finally noticed her, his body reacted before his face did. His shoulders tightened. His breathing shifted. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the recalibration happening behind his eyes. Priya arrived last. She stopped just inside the doorway when she saw the room. For a brief moment, all of her rehearsed narratives collapsed at once. She understood immediately that this was not a conversation she could steer. The space had been arranged without her consent, and she had walked into it willingly. I closed the door behind her. No one sat down at first. That silence stretched longer than was comfortable because everyone was calculating their next move at the same time. I did not rush it. Silence has a way of forcing people to expose themselves without speaking. I began by laying out what each person already knew individually, but had not yet seen intersect. I explained how I came home early. I explained what I saw. I explained that I chose not to react immediately because reactions can be redirected delayed, or denied, but facts persist. I explained that I had taken time to understand the structure of what had been happening instead of reducing it to a single act of betrayal. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I narrated. Ben's wife connected details as I spoke. I watched her expression shift from controlled uncertainty to quiet recognition. She did not interrupt. She did not look at Ben. She watched Priya instead, because that was where the unknowns were. Priya attempted to speak twice and stopped herself both times. That restraint was not discipline. It was fear of choosing the wrong version of the truth in a room where multiple realities were about to collide. Ben tried to redirect. He framed the situation as complicated and mutual, as something that had grown out of circumstance rather than choice. He positioned himself as someone who had not intended harm, as if intention had ever mattered once behavior crossed a certain threshold. That approach failed immediately. His wife asked him about the apartment. Not whether it existed, not whether he used it, but why it had been leased under his company name and used for personal reasons during hours he claimed to be on job sites. That question landed harder than anything I could have said because it cut through emotional framing and into tangible consequence. Priya stepped in then. She reframed the relationship as something that had filled a gap she claimed existed in our engagement. She spoke about pressure, expectations, and feeling unseen. She tried to spread responsibility evenly enough that no one could pin it down. That attempt collapsed under its own contradictions. Timelines did not align. Claims about frequency conflicted with location data. Statements about discretion failed when compared against the casualness with which she had arrived at Ben's apartment repeatedly. She was not improvising poorly. She was repeating a version of events she had practiced for a different audience. I introduced the landlord next. He arrived under the assumption that we were discussing lease violations related to unauthorized occupancy. That assumption turned out to be accurate in ways he had not anticipated. Once he understood the misuse of the property and the involvement of a personal relationship, his tone shifted from neutral to procedural. That shift mattered. It removed the possibility that this situation would remain private. Policies were cited. Notices were discussed. The apartment Ben used as a buffer between his lives ceased to be a shield and became a liability. At that point, the room fractured into separate reactions. Ben's wife stood up. She did not shout or threaten. She stated clearly that she would be consulting an attorney and that any further communication would happen through that channel. She looked at Priya once, not with anger, but with assessment, and then left. Ben followed her out, not because she invited him, but because the alternative was staying in a space where his leverage had evaporated. The landlord left shortly after, outlining next steps in writing. That left Priya and me alone. She tried to speak, but there was nothing left to negotiate. The engagement no longer existed in any practical sense. The wedding contracts had already been reviewed earlier in the week. The clauses regarding misrepresentation and cohabitation violations had already been triggered. The deposits were already in motion. She asked how long I had been planning this. I told her the truth. Not long. Just long enough to make sure the consequences landed where they belonged. The realization that this outcome was not impulsive but inevitable hit her harder than any insult could have. She had prepared for confrontation, not structure. She had expected chaos, not alignment. I left that night with a bag and documents. I did not argue about possessions. I did not demand explanations. I exited a system that had already begun collapsing under its own weight. The morning after everything collapsed did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural. I woke up on Oscar's couch, checked my phone, and saw that the messages had shifted from frantic to controlled. That shift mattered. Panic is honest. Control is damage management. I spent the first few hours handling what could not wait. I contacted the wedding venue and confirmed cancellation under the misrepresentation clause. The coordinator did not ask for explanations. She had already seen enough versions of this story to know when paperwork spoke louder than emotion. The deposits were not fully recoverable, but most of them were. That alone changed the financial outcome of what could have been a long recovery. By midday, Priya's messages stopped entirely. That silence did not signal acceptance. It signaled regrouping. People who lose control rarely surrender it immediately. They look for angles that still exist. I made sure those angles were limited. I returned to the apartment only once, accompanied by a neutral third party, to collect personal belongings. The space already felt different. Not empty, but unstable, like a place waiting for its next owner. Priya was not there. She had arranged to stay elsewhere, likely because the apartment no longer represented safety or leverage. Within days, the ripple effect spread. Ben's wife moved quickly. Attorneys became involved. Shared accounts were frozen pending review. The contractor license associated with Ben's company came under scrutiny due to the misuse of a leased property for personal activity. None of these actions were fueled by revenge. They were responses to documented behavior that no longer had insulation. Ben attempted to contact me once. He framed it as an appeal for discretion, as if discretion had ever been an option once he invited risk into multiple systems at the same time. I did not respond. There was nothing to gain from engaging with someone whose credibility had already dissolved. Priya's situation unraveled more quietly, but no less completely. The apartment lease violation forced her to move sooner than planned. The professional overlap between her work and Ben's contracting network created tension that she could not talk her way out of. Clients do not like unpredictability. Employers do not like attention. Her name began appearing in conversations she was not present for, and that absence made it worse. Mutual friends chose distance. Not because I asked them to, and not because they believed one version of events over another, but because unresolved chaos makes people uncomfortable. When stories conflict without resolution, people step away rather than pick sides. That isolation was not punishment. It was consequence. I relocated within the month. Not dramatically, not to disappear, but to reset context. A new neighborhood, a smaller place, fewer shared memories. I sold the engagement ring through a private dealer, not out of spite, but because objects carry weight that does not belong in a future they were never meant to reach. The money went towards settling remaining costs and funding the move. Clean exits require resources. Therapy became part of my routine, not because I was broken, but because untreated clarity can harden into something less flexible. I needed perspective more than validation. I needed to understand how trust can coexist with awareness without turning into suspicion. Weeks passed, then months. The last time I saw Priya was accidental. It happened at a grocery store on a weekday afternoon. We recognized each other at the same time. She looked different, not physically, but structurally. Less buffered, more alert. The version of confidence she used to carry had been replaced by caution. We exchanged nods. Nothing more. That moment mattered because it confirmed something I had suspected for a while. The power in the situation had never come from exposure or confrontation. It came from alignment. Once actions met consequences without interference, the outcome stabilized on its own. I learned later, through indirect channels, that Ben's marriage ended formally within the year. His business continued, but smaller, quieter, monitored. Reputation does not disappear. It narrows. Priya rebuilt parts of her life. People always do. The difference is that rebuilding without denial takes longer. It forces decisions rather than reactions. I do not know whether she ever connected the moment on the kitchen counter to everything that followed, or whether she still segmented those events to protect herself. It did not matter. The story ended the night I walked out without answering her question. Everything after that was momentum. Not revenge. Not drama. Just consequence, applied evenly, without urgency, and without mercy disguised as kindness.